All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a fascinating set of transcripts and statements from a recent U.S. congressional hearing focused on Iran.
Oh, wow. This sounds right up my alley.
And I think you'll find this one particularly interesting because it really highlights this groundswell of support for regime change in Iran that seems to be coming from both sides of the aisle.
Oh, really? Bipartisan support. That's pretty rare these days.
Right. You don't see that very often, especially when it comes to foreign policy.
So what exactly was this hearing all about?
Well, it was organized by a group of U.S. representatives that call themselves the Parliamentary Group for Human Rights and Democracy in Iran.
Okay, so right off the bat, it sounds like they're not pulling any punches. They're making their stance pretty clear.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
And to make things even more interesting, the star witness at this hearing was Maryam Ravi.
Hold on, Maryam Ravi as in the president-elect of the NCRI.
The one and only. And that's actually a really important point to highlight because throughout the hearing, you hear representatives from both the Republican and Democratic parties referring to her as president-elect.
I see what you're getting at. That's not just a polite formality, a very deliberate choice of words.
Exactly. By consistently using that title, they're lending a certain level of legitimacy to her position and to the NCRI's claim as a viable alternative to the current regime.
That's a really smart strategy. It subtly undermines the current regime while simultaneously boosting the credibility of the opposition.
Right. It's like they're saying, we see you, we recognize you, and we support you, which is a pretty powerful message to send.
Absolutely. So it sounds like this hearing was more than just symbolic. It was a strategic move to bolster the opposition.
And speaking of strategy, Ravi didn't just show up with empty promises. She came prepared with a very specific 10-point plan for a future Iran.
Okay, so let's talk about this 10-point plan. What's it all about?
Well, it gets into some pretty substantial stuff,
Yeah.
like the separation of religion and state.
Oh, wow, that's a big one. That would be a fundamental shift in Iran's political structure.
Right, and she doesn't stop there. She also talks about free elections, gender equality, a non-nuclear Iran. It's a pretty comprehensive blueprint for what a future Iran could look like.
On the surface, it seems to align with what many would consider to be the hallmarks of a modern democracy.
And I think that's the point. This plan isn't just about appealing to Iranians who are dissatisfied with the current regime. It's also about garnering international support.
Makes sense. It's like she's saying, look, we're not just fighting against something, we're fighting for something.
Exactly. And that something is a vision of Iran that's very deliberately framed in terms of universal values, freedom, justice, human rights.
It's a clever way to build a coalition of support both inside and outside of Iran.
Right. And it seems like that message resonated with the U.S. representatives present at the hearing because we heard some pretty strong statements in support of a free Iran.
Like what, for example?
Well, Republican Representative Tom McClintock said, "We are united in our support for the people of Iran and their struggle to be free from the tyranny of the mullahs."
Okay, so that's a pretty clear statement of solidarity coming from a Republican.
And it wasn't just Republicans either. Democrat Representative Brad Sherman echoed that sentiment, adding that the regime poses a threat not only to the people of Iran, but to the entire region and the world.
Wow, so he's elevating it to a global security concern. That's a significant statement.
It is. It suggests that this isn't just an internal Iranian problem. It's something that the international community needs to take seriously.
Right, because if the regime is a threat to the entire region, that has major implications for global stability.
And it adds another layer of complexity to the whole issue of how to approach the situation in Iran.
Speaking of approaching the situation, Representative Steve Cohen was pretty outspoken about the human rights violations happening in Iran.
Yeah, he didn't mince words. He straight up said that the country is ripe for change.
So he clearly believes that the regime's grip on power is weakening.
Yeah, you definitely get that sense. And then you have Representative Randy Weber chiming in with, "Strike while the iron is hot."
Huh. I love a good Texas analogy.
It really captures the sense of urgency that was palpable throughout the hearing. It's like they're saying this is a critical moment, a window of opportunity for change.
So they're not just offering words of support, they're actually advocating for some sort of concrete action.
Exactly. But before we get into what those actions might be, there's another really interesting thread that I noticed running through this hearing.
Oh, what's that?
It's the emphasis on the role of women in the resistance movement.
Okay, yeah, I did pick up on that too. Representative Zoe Lofgren specifically thanked the women of Iran for their bravery, their vision, which is a pretty powerful statement coming from a female representative.
Right. And it's especially interesting considering Maryam Ravi's leadership within the NCRI.
It's more than just interesting. I think it's a deliberate strategy to highlight the NCRI's commitment to gender equality.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's a way to differentiate themselves from the current regime and to signal that they represent a more progressive vision for Iran.
Exactly. It's like they're saying this isn't just about swapping out one set of leaders for another. This is about a fundamental transformation of Iranian society.
Right. And by specifically highlighting the role of women, they're sending a message that this movement is inclusive and that it values the contributions of everyone regardless of gender.
That's a really smart way to broaden their appeal and to build a more diverse coalition of support.
So we've got this broad resistance movement, this compelling 10-point plan, and these calls for international action. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the human element.
Yeah, because behind all the political rhetoric, there are real people whose lives are being deeply affected by all of this.
Exactly. And a couple of the speakers at the hearing shared their own firsthand experiences that I think really bring this home.
Oh, I'm curious. Tell me more.
Well, Representative Danny Davis talked about attending a massive NCRI gathering in Paris, which he described as incredibly moving and inspiring. He was really struck by the passion and commitment of the people he met there.
It's one thing to read about the resistance in news articles or academic journals. It's
Yeah.
quite another to actually witness it firsthand.
Right. It really personalizes the struggle. And then you have Professor Alejo Vidal-Quadras.
I'm not familiar with him. What's his story?
Well, he recounted this really chilling experience of being targeted in a regime-sponsored assassination attempt in Madrid.
Oh, wow. That's terrifying.
It really is, and it just underscores the lengths to which this regime is willing to go to silence its critics.
And the fact that it happened in Madrid highlights the regime's global reach.
Exactly. This isn't just an internal Iranian issue. This is a global concern.
It sounds like we've only just scratched the surface of this deep dive.
You're telling me there's so much more to unpack, but we'll save that for our next installment.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat already.
So that assassination attempt is a pretty sobering reminder of the risks that people face when they oppose this regime, even outside of Iran.
Yeah, it really highlights the ruthlessness of the regime and the global reach of its intelligence apparatus.
It makes you wonder about the internal resistance movement within Iran itself. Who are these people and what are they fighting for?
Well, it's not a monolithic group. It's a
Okay.
really diverse mix of people, students, workers, intellectuals, artists, people from all walks of life.
So what unites them then?
I think it's this shared yearning for a free, democratic, and secular Iran.
So it's not just about changing the government, it's about transforming Iranian society at a fundamental level.
Exactly. And they're not just sitting around waiting for change to happen. They're actively working towards that goal.
Oh, so?
Well, they're organizing protests, distributing information, and constantly pushing back against the regime's narrative, despite the immense risks involved.
I mean, we're talking about imprisonment, torture, even execution for daring to speak out against the regime.
Yeah, the stakes are incredibly high. And that's what makes stories like Representative Davis's experience at the NCRI gathering so powerful.
It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of oppression.
Absolutely. And that's precisely why the speakers in this hearing from both sides of the aisle were so insistent on acknowledging the bravery of the Iranian people.
It's like they're saying, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you.
And that message of solidarity is so important, especially for those who are risking their lives for freedom.
Okay, so we've talked about this broad resistance movement, this compelling 10-point plan, and these calls for international action. But what does all of this actually mean for the average Iranian citizen?
Well, life under the Iranian regime is incredibly challenging for many.
In what ways?
I mean, there's widespread poverty, unemployment, social inequality, and then there are the severe restrictions on basic freedoms.
So it's not just about political freedom, it's about the basic human right to live a life with dignity.
Exactly. People live in constant fear of the regime's repressive forces.
It sounds like a very oppressive environment.
It is. And that's why this hearing felt so significant. It was about amplifying the voices of those who were suffering and giving a platform to those who are fighting for a better future.
And to those who are risking their lives to speak out against the regime.
Right. It's about shining a light on a situation that is often overlooked or misunderstood by the outside world.
And about building a sense of solidarity and support for the Iranian people in their struggle for change.
Absolutely. It's about reminding the world that they're not alone in this fight.
You know, this hearing really presented a stark contrast. On one hand, you have a regime that's portrayed as brutal, repressive, and increasingly isolated on the world stage.
But on the other hand, you have this incredibly resilient resistance movement, both within Iran and among its supporters internationally.
It creates a sense of cautious optimism, wouldn't you say?
I think so. The fight for a free Iran is far from over, but the momentum seems to be shifting.
What makes you say that?
Well, the regime might be trying to project an image of strength, but the cracks are starting to show.
Like what, for example?
Economic sanctions are definitely having an impact,
Mm.
and internal dissent is growing.
And it seems like the regime's ideology is losing its appeal, especially among the younger generation.
Yeah, exactly. There's a growing disconnect between the regime and the people it claims to represent.
It's like a pressure cooker. The heat keeps rising and eventually something has to give.
But the question is, what will that tipping point be? What will it actually take for meaningful change to occur in Iran?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. And revolutions are complex. There's no way to predict exactly what will spark lasting change.
So what should we be looking for?
I think the regime's increasing desperation to maintain control is a key indicator.
How so?
Well, think about it. The crackdown on protesters, the escalating executions, the attempts to silence any form of dissent.
It does seem like they're feeling threatened and cornered.
Exactly. And that desperation could lead to more extreme measures, which could ultimately backfire.
So it's a delicate and dangerous situation.
It is. But it's also a situation where hope and possibility still exist.
So how do we, as informed citizens, contribute to this movement for change?
Well, knowledge is power, and the NCRI has a wealth of resources available on its website.
So educating ourselves and raising awareness are crucial first steps.
Right. It's about breaking through the propaganda and misinformation that the regime often puts out.
And becoming more informed consumers of information.
Exactly. But beyond that, there's the power of advocacy.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we can contact our elected officials, express our support for a free Iran, and urge them to take concrete action to hold the Iranian regime accountable.
So it's about making our voices heard, both individually and collectively.
Exactly. Every voice matters. Every email, every phone call, every act of solidarity, no matter how small, can contribute to building momentum for change.
Now let's dive into some of the specific actions advocated for by the U.S. representatives in this hearing. They talked about triggering the snapback mechanism and placing the regime under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter.
Okay, let's break those down one by one.
So what exactly is the snapback mechanism?
Well, it refers to a provision in the 2015 nuclear deal that allows for the reimposition of UN sanctions on Iran if it violates the terms of the agreement.
So it's like a safety valve to ensure that Iran adheres to the deal.
Exactly. Triggering this would essentially reinstate the sanctions that were lifted as part of the deal, putting significant economic pressure on the Iranian regime.
And what about Chapter 7 of the UN Charter? That sounds pretty serious.
It is. Chapter 7 deals with threats to international peace and security.
So placing the Iranian regime under Chapter 7 would essentially designate it as a threat to world peace.
Right. And that would authorize the UN Security Council to take a range of actions, including economic sanctions, diplomatic measures, and even military intervention, although that's usually considered a last resort.
So these are some pretty heavy-duty tools in the international relations toolbox.
They are. And it sounds like the representatives are really pushing for a more assertive approach toward the Iranian regime.
So it seems like these representatives see the Iranian regime as a threat, not just to its own people, but to the whole region and maybe even the world.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex geopolitical situation with a lot at stake.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about the bipartisan support for a free Iran, Maryam Rabi's 10-point plan, and the resilience of the resistance movement.
We've also looked at the human cost of the regime's repression and the calls for international action.
It's clear that the situation in Iran is incredibly complex. What are your final thoughts?
Well, there's no easy answers. But amidst all the darkness, there are glimmers of hope.
What do you mean?
The Iranian people are incredibly courageous and determined in their pursuit of freedom.
And there's a growing wave of support for their cause, both within Iran and internationally.
Right. So while the challenges are immense, the human spirit can prevail even in the darkest of times.
This hearing really highlighted that the fight for a free Iran isn't just an Iranian issue, it's a global one.
Absolutely. It's a fight for human rights, for democracy, and for a more peaceful and just world.
And it's a fight that deserves our attention, our support, and our solidarity.
I couldn't agree more.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening for me. I came into this with a general understanding of the situation, but I'm leaving with a much deeper appreciation for the nuances and the complexities.
It's always more complicated than it seems on the surface.
And honestly, despite the challenges, I'm left with a sense of cautious optimism.
Me too. While the challenge